Blood slicked the stone like a dark confession as Mara Valen kicked the door open, and there he was. Elias sprawled on the floor of the infirmary, half of his shirt gone to ragged strips, the other half clinging to his shoulder where a sliver of jagged iron had kissed skin and bone. He blinked up at her with that human stubbornness that had never understood the physics of her world, that a human could be at the edge of breaking and still refuse to break completely. Mara's knuckles hurt from the chainmail she'd forgotten to remove before she charged in. The crescent moon in her spine ached with the authority that made wolves follow her with or without fear. She should have felt nothing but command, but seeing Elias like this, the joke he had made in the barracks a week ago echoed in her ribs like an unanswered dare. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. "You bleed like a poet," Mara snapped, dropping to one knee without the ceremony her rank deserved. Her voice was steel, threaded with something like amusement. The pack walls had taught her to hide amusement. Elias's mouth twitched. "You always talk like I'm about to spill metaphors," he rasped. He tried to sit up and nearly fell back. Mara's hand, single-gloved, steadied his shoulder with a gentleness she rarely permitted herself to show. The juxtaposition, iron and touch, felt obscene in a place where every gesture could be weaponized. Elias was the kind of man who wore soft grief like an invisible cloak, his hair tangled from sleepless hours at the young mother's hut, his fingers stained with herbal pastes and the memory of every child he'd held through fevers. He was human in a territory that measured worth by fur and fang and the cruel geometry of dominance. He could not run in the moonlight. He could not howl and will wolves to bend their wills. He could, however, stitch a broken humerus with hands that knew how to coax a body back into service. He could hold a child who had watched her father mangled at the border and not flinch when the room smelled of iron and smoke and grief. Where wolves built cathedrals out of power, Elias built altars out of small, quiet mercies. "You should have sent for a beta," Elias muttered, but his voice was thinner than bravado. Mara saw the way the fight had left room for fear. She gritted her teeth. There was no reason a future Luna should do the dirt work that would make the pack label her soft. There were reasons also she could not say aloud. Reasons that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with the way Elias's pulse had steadied beneath her palm. Her inheritance had been discipline, heritage of iron and ritual. Her mother had taught her to carve commands into the air like runes, to let no human softness dull the blade of her will. And yet she'd grown up watching the Northwatch trust Elias, watching how his hands could calm an infant who'd seen wolves go to war. That trust had lodged against Mara's sternum like a secret tooth. "Don't get cute," Mara said, because that was what leaders did. They hid tremors. They issued orders. "Hold still." Her gloved fingers found the tiny angle the bone needed. She hissed, and Elias swore under breath. The infirmary's lamp threw their pictures against a wall, her shadow inked with the silhouette of armor, his softer and nearer to the floor. A nurse, a young Omega with hands still shaking from her first season's blood, hovered at the doorway. The quiet among them was a truce, temporary, fragile. "You saved Calder's youngest last moon," Elias said suddenly, voice small as a confession. "You did it without a thought. You did it and then screamed orders like a general. You are incapable of both, Mara Valen." He looked at her with an intimacy that scared her, a man seeing the seams of her, not the armor. "You can be both." Mara wanted to correct him. Order and mercy had always been separated in the Northwatch hierarchies. The rumor of merging them would topple alliances. But there was warmth in his words, and it connected to something dangerous beneath her sternum. "I am not trying to be both," she lied, and the lie tasted like metal. Outside, a distant shout unfurled, the patrol coming back from the northern ridge, voices threaded with adrenaline. Calder's name was a curse and a rallying banner often enough that the sound made Mara think of him. Calder Kest, the rival who prowled territories with a hunger cut from a different cloth than her own. Stories about him had teeth. He believed in dominance as the only virtue, and in dismantling anything that smelled like softness. If a Luna looked like she favored tenderness, Calder would use it like a whetstone. He had already eyes, ears, and a mouth that fashioned rumors into knives. Elo's injured hand trembled when Mara unwrapped the makeshift dressing. She wanted to say something easy, something that would exorcise the tremble, something like, "You'll be all right." Instead, she said, "You lied on the field for a ridiculous reason." He snorted. "A man tries to protect the wrong girl, and it is always ridiculous." He stared at her then, and the look was not of a patient or a townsman, but of someone cataloging a map. Areas of approach, where to be tender, where to be careful. "You're not supposed to be here tonight," Mara said finally, more to the shadows than to Eli. Northwatch nights were for the pack. Humans were safe inside their villages, not walking border trails at the hour wolves grew restless. Eli's smile was crooked. "You say that like I belong in a pot with the soup." "You belong in the center of the pack, in terms of what people put on you," Mara said, voice low. The walls had ears. So did the guards outside. She checked herself. But not in the way you think. She was careful, always careful, because titles were fragile. A rumor that the future Luna favored a human could fracture loyalties. Already she could imagine Calder, patient predator, hearing about this and spinning a tale that would undermine her claim. That Mara favored softness over steel. That she would be easy to bend. That Northwatch would be vulnerable under her watch. Elias watched her with a warped tenderness that both steadied and unnerved her. "You asked me once," he said, and the memory hit her like a thrown stone. The night of the harvest feast, when she had been younger and more reckless, when guards were drunk and the moon was a generous ledger in the sky. "You asked what I desired." The bluntness of the question had been unlike her. Ancient rituals setting aside for an afternoon. She'd been off guard, and everyone knew it. "So I joked," Elias went on quietly, the words small but sharp. "You," I said. "I meant it like a coin tossed. But I didn't think you'd take jokes as currency." Mara sat back on her heels, chainmail chinking like a memory. The moon had angled through the infirmary window exactly then, painting a pale sickle over her forearm. Her mouth went dry. She remembered the laugh that had followed, her own, brittle and unhelpful. She remembered others leaning in, the way murmurs started like sparks in a dry forest. She had thought the moment passed. She had not considered that a tossed coin could grow roots. "I thought it was a game," Mara said. She should have stopped there. That would have been the safe thing to do. But there was something about Elias's vulnerable honesty that demanded something else. "I didn't know," she faltered. Saying that she'd meant it, that she'd named him as a possibility, would expose a chink in armor she'd spent a lifetime forging. Elias reached for her hand before she could decide what to do. His fingers were warm, an anomaly in the cold air of protocol. "It's okay," he whispered. "I didn't expect to be anything but a laugh. I can always be a laugh." He let go too quickly, as if fearing the audacity of staying. The movement left a hollow in Mara's chest the size of a fist. They heard voices outside the infirmary, guards trading barbs, some of them with the brand of Calder's influence in loosened laughter. A wind pushed against the building, carrying the scent of pine and pack blood. Mara felt the ancient part of herself wake, the part taught to measure winds and words alike. Calder would be circling. He had always circled the weak with a doggedness that made the pack's bones rattle. If murmurs grew into accusation, it would not be a simple scandal. It would be a power play aimed at unraveling the last of her claim. Mara's obligations folded over her like a cloak. The pact her mother had woven with neighboring packs to secure Northwatch's borders. The arranged union the council expected her to honor as a strategic seal. There was a ledger of duty with ink that did not flinch at emotion. Yet, sitting on the infirmary floor with Elias's pulse under her palm, her inheritance of iron felt perilously human. Authority, she had been taught, demanded a sacrifice of softness. But what if strength could include softness? What if leadership could bear tenderness without splintering? The thought was treasonous to most, revolutionary to a few, and fatal if Calder found the chance to twist it. "You'll need to keep this quiet," Mara said softly, the words a command disguised as counsel. Her mouth was a machine trained in the economy of danger. "No one has to know how often you wander the borders at night. No one has to know the way you look at me." Her voice stubbornly refused to turn into a plea. She was, after all, the future Luna. Pleading was an art she had been denied. Elias laughed, an easy sound like a mix of exasperation and relief. "I have never been talented at secrecy," he admitted. "Maybe that's my charm." He tried to stand and the room swayed around him. Mara's hand went instinctively to his elbow, steadying him with an intimacy that had the potential to be weaponized in hushed halls. "But I'll try, for you. Not because I'm afraid of rumors, but because your future is heavier than my stubbornness." Behind the words, Mara felt the dilemma bloom. Protect the pack's future by denying a piece of herself, or risk everything for a tenderness that might be the pack's salvation instead of its ruin. Calder's shadow lengthened like a thread. There would be whispers, then accusations, then the kind of violence that left families bereft under the full moon. The pact on her shoulders was not just political, it was a covenant of survival. Yet every time Elias smiled at her, his grin carrying the battered courage of a healer who'd held too many broken things, Mara wondered if survival required her to let an old tradition die. She wrapped Elias's shoulder with fresh bandages, her fingers steady even as her mind hurled between politics and person. Outside, the pack shifted like a living thing that could smell the coming storm. Calder's name, soft as a threat, threaded through the night air. Mara's heart stuttered, not from fear of Calder alone, but from the knowledge that naming desire could be an act of war. She had asked Elias what he desired. He had thrown a word like a coin. Now the world had begun to rearrange itself, and she had to decide which architecture of loyalty it would fall into. The night pressed its face to the infirmary window, as it too listened for the verdict. Mara tightened the bandage, and for a moment let herself imagine a life where decisions were not public property, where she could wake and not be measured against a ledger, where Elias might be only a neighbor who knocked for a remedy, rather than a dangerous horizon she'd named in a joke. The thought passed like a feather. Duty had teeth and tides. She had been raised to move with them, to redirect them, to become an anchor for a whole people. "You have to rest," she said, which was another way of asserting command. Elias let her tuck a blanket around him, the blanket smelling faintly of chamomile and the smoke from the common hearth. He closed his eyes for a beat and then opened them again, sharper. "Tell me about Calder," he said, suddenly, voice flat with acquired knowledge, as if gossip and strategy were equally counted in his skill set. "What does he want besides the obvious? What does he hit when he tries to make you fall?" Mara looked at him as though he had asked her to read the runes on her palm. "He wants proof we can be broken," she said. "Proof that soft things live at the center of power." The truth was knotted. Calder needed to show that Northwatch could be made pliant, softened, and then his allies would press from the edges until the pack yielded. He paints mercy as weakness. He will twist anything that humanizes the future Luna into evidence that she cannot keep a pack safe. Elias listened with a healer's patience, as if every name could be treated like a wound examined under light. "So he makes you choose," he said, "between doing what the pack expects and doing what you might want to be." He didn't finish the sentence because finishings in their world were often painful. Mara was struck by how astute he was, how a man whose nights were spent binding bones could see the arithmetic of power beneath the poetry. "That is the math of his hunger," she said. She imagined Calder's grin, a wolf grin polished to the point of cruelty. If he can show that Northwatch's heart is sentimental, he will get to cut the throat of our alliances. He will tell the other packs that I can be moved by tenderness, and that I will be moved to mercy when mercy costs us strategy. He will call it failure, and they will sign on. He will take our borders like a tide takes the shore. Elias's jaw worked. "And if you close off everything," he said, "if you let him paint you as iron alone, what do you do to yourself?" The question was pointed and precise and dangerous because it assumed she had inner life beyond duty. The room seemed to pirouette around the question, and Mara felt the old, trained answer, that of shutting down like a hatch, press against her ribs. "I could be efficient," she said, knowing the word had a kind of brittle glory. "I could keep the pack safe." "And you would be alone," Elias finished. He watched her with the frankness that sometimes made her want to reorder his features into armor. "You would have safety at the cost of company. You would be whole as stone and lonely as one." The words landed somewhere between insult and prophecy, and Mara could not choose which. She thought of the long nights in the great hall when she ate standing and listened to leather boots over the flagstones and learned to answer without flinching. She had been forged to command, yes, but she had also been given eyes that sometimes saw things other alphas missed. The texture of a child's fear, the cadence of a grieving woman's request. Elias's presence was a mirror she'd long avoided. Outside, a stray voice rose, low laughter cut with something sharper. Calder's acolytes were parade practicing their gossip. Mara felt the brush of panic, the sense that a net was being woven just beyond the door. She stood abruptly, the chainmail chiming like a warning. "I need to speak to the council," she said. "Tonight." Her voice was a blade. Elias folded his hands over his bandaged shoulder and tried to stand to protest. She put a hand on his shoulder and stopped him. "Stay," she ordered, softer than she meant. "You are a liability on the council floor, and I will not afford you, a healer with more courage than rank, the hazard of being a scapegoat." Elias's eyes flared with hurt and indignation. "I am not some toy you put behind the curtain," he said. "I am a man." He swallowed. "I do not belong in that council's rhetoric, but I cannot pretend I do not have a stake." His voice flapped its wing like a bird wanting to be seen. Mara felt the old instinct to protect him and the new sense of him as a person with claims of his own. She hated that the pack's rules made her choose for him. It was a power she possessed and a cruelty she could not easily excuse. "You have a stake," she agreed, because it was true. "But I will not bring you into their kinds of calculus." She rested her palm on his bandage once more, thinking of the way the moonlight had once made him seem as if he might get up and howl. The idea was absurd and impossible, and part of her could not tell which part of the impossibility made her more afraid. Elias leaned into the touch with a small, almost furtive relief that tore at something in her that would have called it love in a quieter world. The council met in the Hall of Tides, stone benches circling like ribs, banners hanging like vows. Mara knew their faces the way she knew the pattern of the moon. Some were carved from the same stern wood as her mother's, some plastered by fear and a hunger for safety. Calder would be there, present by proxy if not in body, and in his place a wolf with a smile like contract. The thought of the hall made Mara's muscles set. She dressed in ceremonial muted colors the next hour, chainmail beneath, and the cloak her mother had folded around herself the day she signed the pact that would one day be Mara's burden to carry. Elias walked with her to the outer gate, limping at a gait that made her chest ache. "Don't get yourself killed," he muttered, half joke, half fear. Mara almost laughed. She had never been killed by council words, but each time she'd come back a little more hollow. "I won't," she said, though the truth of it was conditional. "You could move the council, you know," Elias said, as they reached the gate and the night air opened to them. "Not with talk alone, though you have a tongue, but with the way you let yourself be seen. Strength that holds tenderness isn't weakness, it's method. It would be a dangerous method, but," he hesitated, "I'd follow you if you asked." The admission should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like an echo that bounced between the sternum and the spine. Mara thought of Calder's smile and the teeth beneath it. If she let herself be seen, Calder would see, and he would tear. Yet the alternative was to keep the tenderness locked and perhaps break herself into pieces that the pack would never fully claim. For the first time in a long while, she pictured leading not by fear, but by a different claim, by the moral authority of someone who held both sword and salve. The image seemed ridiculous and luminous at once, and she tasted the salt of near hope. The council's chamber smelled of old incense and older grudges. Torches guttered and shadows pooled like waiting things. Calder's men were there, blatant like teeth. They spared no time in planting rumors, small jokes that dripped venom like a stew. And watchful eyes turned to her with a hunger you could taste. The hall vibrated with the precise moment before a knife comes out. Charged, expectant, inevitably violent in its smallness. Mara felt the weight of every expectation like a stone at her throat. "You ask for silence about a healer's nightly wanderings," Calder said as soon as she took the stand. His voice was silk with a blade threaded through. "You ask we omit what might reveal your distractions. This is the care of a pack? Or the sheltering of indulgence?" He leaned forward, and the murmurs swelled like a pack testing the night. Mara's throat tightened, but her voice did not fail. "A healer's work is not gossip," she said. "It is survival." Around her, the assembly shifted. Some nodded, some watched with preternatural calculation. Calder smiled in the way of men who were practiced at unspooling a web. "Survival," he repeated, "or weakness disguised as mercy." Elias's presence in the doorway, in the body-guarded threshold where he'd been told to stay, was a quiet defiance that stung Calder's smile. The rival's eyes slid to him like a hawk checking for broken wing. "And what of your own attachments, Mara Valen? Will you choose alliance by law or by heart?" Calder's question hung like thunder. He was not asking for an answer. He was baiting a trap. Mara felt the room constrict. To answer by law would be to rattle with the clink of ceremonial chains. To answer by heart would be to hand Calder the knife he sought. The pack leaned forward collectively, waiting not for her to decide, but to settle the bookkeeping of their future. Elias's hand found hers in the darkness beyond the doorframe, a small, private act that felt like prayer, and she squeezed, a private pact in a public war. "In times of attack," she said, choosing her words with the careful ferocity of someone who knew the cost of each syllable, "we judge by results. Mercy that endangers our people is not mercy at all. But cruelty that claims to be strategy while bleeding us dry is not strength. The hall erupted into noise. Some loved the answer's balance. Others, Calder most visibly, found their knives dulled by it. He was not content to be dulled. He rose, voice dropping to a dangerous velvet. You will need to prove that you can separate sentiment from strategy, Luna, or we will find someone who can. At the edges of the hall, allegiance rearranged itself like cards being shuffled. Mara felt the shift underfoot as if the earth itself were deciding. Elias stepped forward then, ignoring the edict she had given him, and the room's temperature dropped a degree. He looked at Calder with the fierce simplicity that had made Mara laugh, the irreplaceable human arrogance of someone who believed truth mattered more than safety. "You cannot make leaders into statues and call it wisdom," he said. "You cannot demand they give up their hearts and call it art. The pack will know the difference between a stone and a guardian." Calder laughed, a hollow, too loud sound that sought to shame Elias for stepping outside his place. "A brave speech for a man who cannot howl at the moon," Calder said. "You are misplaced, healer." Elias's reply was a single, steady look at Mara that said more than any speech could have. "I will stand." The act of standing altered the course of the debate. Calder's allies looked uncertain. Northwatch's fortunes had always shifted on such small acts of courage. Mara understood then with a clarity that was almost cruel. This was not simply about keeping a healer out of council. This was a chessboard, and Elias had moved a piece she had not meant him to touch. When the council broke, whispers followed her like a trail of smoke. Outside, the night was colder, and Calder's men lingered with the patience of predators. Mara walked to where Elias waited, shoulder square, chest tight. Around them, the pack divided in a new way. Some people moving toward the idea of ruling with a different grammar, others recoiling like wounds from the sun. "You endangered yourself," she said without heat. "You endangered me," Elias countered, "and I would do it again." The defiance in his voice was not naive. It was a quiet arithmetic of love and consequence. Mara felt the balance tilt. She had to decide whether to protect him from the pack's teeth or let him bear the cost of his own bravery. The decision tasted of iron and of something far older. Calder watched them from the shadows, eyes narrowed into knives. His lips twitched with a promise that was as much a threat as a prophecy, that he would not stop until he had either broken her or made her name mean something he could own. Mara felt the sweep of the coming fight, a fight that would not be finished with blades alone. It would be fought with rumor, ritual, and the stubbornness of a human who had dared to name a desire with a careless joke and then refused to be dismissed when it became a reality. They stood under the moon, both of them smaller and larger than the roles the pack insisted upon. In the infirmatory earlier, the moon had painted her forearm in pale light. Now it hung like a witness to the first blast of an inevitable war. Mara's heart beat with a rhythm she had never permitted herself to hear before, a pattern of fear, longing, and the impossible tenderness of someone who believed they might be brave enough to remake a pack. The first blow was not metal. It was silence. A silence that sat heavy between Mara and the council, as if someone had pressed a hand across the room and asked it to hush. The second blow came in the form of a whisper, and then a second, and things that had been private were suddenly public, like entrails spilled in a common alley. Calder's men had been patient. They had a calendar for humiliation, and they'd chosen the night when tempers were raw and the moon was an unblinking witness. By the time the sun crawled the horizon, the rumor,
First a rumor, then a rope, had been tossed through the town. The ledger of gossip had a new entry. The future Luna kept a human close, and he did not hide the way he looked at her. It began as small things: a tipped cup, a guard's compliment that came with a wink, casual remarks about Mara's softness, couched as concern. Then a message was left on the Great Hall's steps, anonymous, inked with the scent of someone else's contempt, a list of names with aliases among them, implying favors and partialities, as if the thing that bound leaders to people could be counted like coin. Calder's allies took those tokens and spun them into argument. They did not have proof beyond whispers. Proofs were not always necessary. Power was often the comfortable conviction that anyone you disliked had been compromised. Mara watched it all with the peculiar, trained detachment of someone taught to weigh storms. Still, each barb lodged like a thorn. The council's patience dwindled into pointed questions about judgment. A few voices that had once answered to her mother's steadiness now adopted Calder's cadence, turning her compassion into a liability. The pack's loyalty is not a single river, but a braided set of streams. If a whisper can dam one, the rest flow elsewhere. She read each face like a map. Some faces offered temporary refuge, others judged her as if she'd committed a sacrilege. Elias bore it badly. He was not made for the slow cruelty of rumor. He had seen grief that arrived suddenly and raw, and knew how to stitch flesh. But when suspicion targets your conscience and your motives, it is a different wound. He began to avoid the square, to close his shutters earlier, to make his visits to the infirmary seem purely professional. The way he walked around the world, eyes lowered, hands busy, felt like apology. Mara hated that the pack's rules demanded he pay for her possible compassion. Rumors, like wolves, hunt by scent. Calder fed them with pointed acts. He organized patrols that lingered on the human settlements longer than necessary, using the excuse of safety to probe the village's loyalties. A medic's ledger went missing, an oil lamp was stolen, a child's toy had its leather torn, as if by teeth. Each small cruelty the pack could blame on stray predators, Calder insisted were the natural cost of weakness. The message was clear: softness endangers children. Mercy invites predators. Then came the night that broke the fragile truce and revealed a secret no one had expected. Elias had a grandmother's talisman, a small silver charm threaded into a cord he wore tucked beneath his shirt. He rarely spoke of it. It was a relic from a woman who had once hummed lullabies in a house where wolves and humans had been neighbors in a gentler era. The charm had been sentimental. He had told Mara about it once, laughingly, as if it were a token of a family he loved, not a thing that could change the map of their world. Calder's men found it by design, not luck. One of them intercepted Elias while he walked from the infirmary after a late-night shift. They said they simply felt the road bent to curiosity, and his answers were polite at first until one of them spat a word, lichen, and the rest of the sentence became a hunt. They shoved him hard, and the talisman slipped free, clinking on the stone like a sin exposed. They recognized the old craftsmanship, runes half-remembered, a sigil the elders had laughed about in history when humans and wolves had bartered and married and the world had been less tidy in labels. Calder made certain copies of the charm's markings were distributed among the townsfolk. He took the rumor, the smoke, and fed it oxygen. Now the rumor had a corroborative artifact. Calder walked through the town and let the people's fear bloom into accusation. And it took little more than the suggestion that Elias might carry wolf blood to transform murmurs into a kind of fear that sharpened knives. The leadership's paranoia found a direction. When Mara heard of the talisman, her first reaction was fury, so hot it burned her tongue. Whoever had stolen it and used it as tinder had stepped into a war they did not understand. Her second reaction, deeper, more complicated, was a cold knowledge that if the talisman was proof of dormant lycanthropy in Elias, the pack would have a theological problem and an immediate political one. The codes were clear in their old script. A human with wolf blood belonged to the pack as kin, perhaps, but their claim could be used to entangle the Luna in unexpected ways. Calder would not hesitate to use that tangle as a noose. She hunted for Elias that night like a predator who had been taught all her life to close distance. She found him by the river, fingers in the water, talisman clutched between his palms, working the cord as if some simple prayer could pull it whole again. His face had the look of a man who had been unmade and was trying to find his pieces. When Mara spoke, her voice was rawer than the armor that hung on her ribs. "Did you tell them anything?" she asked. He raised his head, and for a moment the moon made his eyes into two honest coins. "No," he said. "I gave them nothing. I thought it was an accident, a theft. I thought if I kept quiet, it would pass." He smiled then, a thin string of humor in a storm. "I did not think men would ignite a relic into a crucible." Mara wanted to wrap him and hide him in the vault of old treaties and bones. Instead, she felt the old calculus. If Elias was suspected of blood that touched the moon, the council's first instinct would be to claim him as a liability. They would weigh him against alliances, bargains, treaties. He would be used to test her by fire. Her name would be leveraged. She thought of the pact, of the marriage arranged to secure borders, and the cold and simple arithmetic of Calder's plan came into full circle. Accuse the Luna of dangerous tenderness, provoke a crisis with an artifact that suggested wolf blood, and then propose a union that would be the safe alternative. Someone hardened, proven, a wolf bred and bloodstained to the tooth. Elias's confession came out slowly, like a rope being pulled through water. He had always suspected something about his blood, he said. The talisman had belonged to a grandmother who'd told bedtime stories of a world when the moon had been kinder and men had changed under it. For years he'd thought those stories were just stories. Then he'd found minor things, strange dreams of running with a pack, the way his ears sometimes registered sounds a beat earlier than everyone else's. He had never transformed, he had never howled and felt a wolf inside him, and he had been relieved enough to treat it as a family myth. The talisman, Mara realized, was not proof of certain lycanthropy. It was proof that someone had thought the possibility worth keeping as a memory. When the council learned of the talisman, reaction fractured. Some elders called for him to be watched, for his movements to be restricted, lest the pack be endangered by an ambiguous center. Others, more mercenary, saw a chance. If Elias could be proved wolf-adjacent, Mara could be pressured into marrying a pack ally to secure pure leadership. Calder's plan had succeeded in creating a crisis that looked organic. The pack smelled power, and power found a mouth. Mara stood in the great hall while men argued about custody and loyalty and lineage. Calder watched like a predator delighted by a trap sprung. Elias stood at the back, his figure small and raw, the talisman glinting at his throat like an accusation. The hall's air became something thick and nearly solid. The syllables of the old laws sounded denser now, heavy with implication. Mara felt the world she had thought she was training to control, slipping into a new shape she hadn't chosen. Betrayal arrived when an ally she had trusted rose in the council and, in a voice that wavered like a reed, suggested Elias be bound to house arrest, cared for, watched, kept safe, in a way that would also keep Mara safe from inconvenient choices. The suggestion was wrapped in kindness. It was cruelty in plausible clothing. Mara felt cold in the face, as though a part of her had turned to stone. "You would incarcerate a healer in the name of caution?" she asked, the words brittle. "You would bind a man who has mended our wounded for seasons and make him a bargaining piece?" The elder's eyes were practiced in the art of consolation. "We would bind danger," he said. "We would spare the pack." Mara looked at Elias then, wanting to ask him what he wanted, what he feared, whether he would be a prisoner willingly. He shook his head, slow and incomprehensible. "I will not be caged because men are frightened," he said. Calder smiled like an answer, and the hall thinned into a line. The vote passed in the heavy way of things that pretend to be reasoned. Elias would be bound to the healer's hut for observation. It was not the worst they could fashion for him, but it was a judgment that would reduce him to a thing to be managed, and in doing so, it stripped Mara of a person she had called friend, possibly more, in a single stroke. The fracture scalded. Mara felt the taste of salt and metal, and a rage that had the clean geometry of a blade. Calder had not used a sword yet. He had used policy and rumor, and the ancient fear that binds packs together. He had found a soft seam and pulled it loose until the whole thing unraveled. Elias led to the hut with 2 guards, who watched him like they might pounce at an irregular heartbeat, turned once to Mara. There was no plea in his eyes. He had been stripped of pretense, but not of dignity. "Do not let them make you small to please them," he said, voice a thread and a command. "They will cut away the parts of you that complicate their neatness. Do not let them." The tip of his warning was a gift, a hope tailored into a harsh truth. She watched him go, and felt a part of herself walk out with him. Calder had not yet struck with fangs, but the pack had shifted. A line had been marked. Secrets had become weapons, trust had been chipped away, and love, if that was what it had been, was brittle under the weight of the pack's needs. She stood in a hall that had once been her home, and understood with a clarity that hurt. To lead would demand choices that could break people you loved. To love would demand a courage older than any single law. The fracture had opened. It would not be mended by apology or policy alone. It would require a different kind of strength, a claim that might cost her everything. They led Elias through the snow-dusted lane like a man carrying a rumor instead of a body. 2 guards on either side, their gloved hands staying politely on leather, but their eyes trained like hounds. Mara walked behind them, boots sinking into cold and choice with equal weight. Every step felt like a ledger entry, every breath a note added to a book Calder had opened in the town's name. The moon watched them with a thin, impartial eye, as if it were tired of being asked to judge humans and wolves. Mara's fingers curled around the cloak at her throat until the woven fabric bit into her skin. She tasted iron and salt and a grief that had nothing to do with loss and everything to do with betrayal. When the guards set Elias inside the healer's hut, the single lamp threw his shadow long and honest against the wall. He did not plead, he did not beg. The talisman hung bare now, the cord frayed where it had been pulled. He smiled at her with a softness that looked like defiance. "Go," he said. It was not an order, it was a request carefully placed on the floor between them. "Do what you must." In that instant, Mara understood precisely how a person becomes an emblem. When they consent to be less than they are in order to protect someone else, they become a warning as well as a lesson. The council's verdict would hold for the week or the season, or until someone found a new excuse to sharpen teeth. It did not matter in the immediate currency of the night. Mara could feel the pack rearranging itself the way a bone resets after a break, jagged, painful, necessary. She stayed at the hut's door until the guards closed it, until the quiet swallowed them. The door was a promise now, either of reunion or of absence. She could not tell which. Outside, Calder's men moved like vultures around a half-built triumph. They had not yet raised their banners in triumph. That would be indulgent. Instead, they pried at edges, a supply line here, a whispered accusation there. They were patient instruments of erosion. Mara watched them and felt the old hunger for retribution rise inside her like an old scar waking. She tempered it quickly. The Luna's work was not vengeance, it was preservation. But preservation could be an act of furious tenderness when wielded by someone who understood what it meant to keep a living thing whole. She did not go to the council to yell. She went because the chamber held the map of their future, and she intended to redraw it by stealth if not by assent. When she entered, the heat of argument had cooled into strategy, and Calder's grin was the kind of same old thing that could break a town. He watched her pass with the possessive satisfaction of a gambler who'd set a table on fire and now admired the flames. Mara took the stand with the faintest of tremors, only Elias would have noticed. She steadied herself and spoke. "We will not bind our people to fear," she said. "We will not make prisoners of compassion." Her voice was quieter than the accusation. It was the unusual voice of someone who had learned to govern by refusing to become the thing she fought. The assembly's air shifted like a flock startled, and for a moment the space between words became a battleground. Then Mara laid out a plan that tasted like daring, watchfulness without incarceration, counsel without punishment, a court of inquiry that invited testimony rather than indictment. She proposed a guard of volunteers, betas and elders whose loyalty was to truth rather than rumor, to attend Elias in the hut and to the border alike. She proposed public forums where grievances could be aired and measured, and where Calder's own patrols would be transparent in presence and purpose. The plan was a risk. It handed power to the people she sought to protect, and that made some in the council uncomfortable. Calder interrupted with the practiced venom of someone who had never been denied a stage. He called for harsher measures, called for the immediate detainment of any human suspected of wolf blood. His voice was a blade wrapped in silk. The debate swelled, and Mara held to the phrases she had chosen, refusing to be baited, refusing to make the demonstration his plan relied on, the spectacle of her failing. When votes were cast, the result was not clean victory. It was not defeat either. The council agreed to her plan by the narrowest of margins, voices swaying toward the future she proposed because some among them feared the violence Calder promised more than the unknown she offered. Calder huffed, but he could not yet throw a knife without leaving his hand empty. He left the hall with his pride skinned and his intent sharpened. Mara felt neither triumph nor relief. She felt the slender bridge she had made under her feet and knew it could be burned at any hour. That night, she walked to the healer's hut herself, not as a Luna, but as a woman who had decided to keep faith with a person she loved despite the cost. The guards stepped aside like reeds. Elias sat by the lamp, hands folded. He looked tired in a way that made Mara want to gather him up and hide him in the marrow of the world. "They'll watch me," he said. "They'll take measurements and write them down and call them wisdom." His humor had gone thin. "They will watch," she agreed, "and I will watch them watch." Her promise was a small flame. "You will not be isolated," she added, "not by me." Elias's laugh was a thing of surprise and gratitude. "You could have sent someone else," he said. "You did not." "I could have," Mara said, "but I didn't. Because sometimes the only measure of leadership is whether you are willing to be seen holding the thing the pack hates. That is the test given to anyone who claims to lead. I will take it." Her words were not grand. They were worn and honest, the way a bandage looks after a day of use. They spent the evening like that, talking in low fragments about small things: the mower's boy who had broken his leg, the recipe for nettle broth, the time Elias's grandmother had taught him to carve a bird from a scrap of wood. Their laughter came in breaks, as if they both worried it might be stolen. Outside, the town hummed. Inside the hut, time grew something like softness. 2 nights later, Calder made his move, not with a blade, but with a calculated raid on the eastern border, where the pack's scouts watched for incursions. He timed the move to coincide with a moon that would make the wolves restless, and designed to prove that weakness invited attack. The raiders were careful and cruel. They set traps that made it look as if prey had come for the pack, then slipped away to let alarm spread. When the wolves responded, the raiders were ready to watch the confusion bloom. Calder wanted to show the council that a Luna softened by mercy left children and borders exposed. Mara heard the alarm as if it were a chord struck wrong. She ran to the edge of the ridge where the world opened and listened to the pack's music. Barks, commands, howls threaded with panic. It was a weave of duty and fear, and she felt its pull like tide. Elias came after her, though. The councils had insisted he remain sheltered. The guards had threatened mutiny, but found their loyalty pulled by something else, a healer's stubbornness for his people. He was at her side, bandaged hand clenched around her sleeve. "We go," he said simply. "I'm not a soldier, but I can stitch a torn tendon faster than I can bite my tongue." Mara gave the order, and the North Watch moved. There was no grand battle at the ridge. Calder had expected chaos. He hadn't expected preparation. Mara had used the council's indecision as a mask, and in the confusion where rumor became action, she positioned defenders at choke points Calder's men had counted as free. The ambush that Calder thought he had engineered became a lesson in underestimating a Luna who could read a map of fear and protect her people anyway. When Calder's men wolfed into the false clear, they found traps they had set themselves, snares that turned on a night wind, and wolves waiting in patience rather than fury. The skirmish was short, brutal, and decisive. Calder's men took heavier losses than they anticipated because they had prepared to burn a town, while Aluna had instead taught her people how to hold a line. Calder watched from the far ridge as his plan bled like a miswired limb. He retreated with curses and a promise of reckoning that tasted like bile. In the aftermath, the wounded were tended. Elias's hands worked their old magic, closing wounds, calling for cool herbs, murmuring names of remedies like prayers. Mara found herself watching him, not as an instrument, but as the center of a small, fierce gravity. The pack, raw from the raid, watched her too. Some faces changed a degree toward respect. Others remained cautious. But a shift had occurred. Elias had not been a scapegoat. He had been necessary. He had stitched the flesh of the pack, and with that action, he had reminded them that survival is not made of iron alone. Calder's retreat bought Mara a period of truce. He would sulk, he would plan, he would never stop testing seams. But the raid had failed to bring the reckoning he sought. For a moment, at least, the town breathed. Later, when the moon leaned like an old listener across the valley, Mara sat by the river and found Elias wading in the shallows, the water cold as decision. He turned when she came, and the talisman around his neck glittered like an old secret. He held out his hands, and they were steady. "You could have left me bound in the hut," he said. "You did not." "You would not have stayed bound," she countered. "You are a healer. You could not stop doing the thing you do without losing yourself." He stepped closer until the moonlight knifed across his face, and she saw everything she had almost lost. The humor, the stubbornness, the kindness that was not weakness, but a different kind of strength. "I would have been safe," he said, "but I would also have been diminished. I would have been reduced to a rumor." Mara considered that. The pack's rules chewed at the edges of her will: law, duty, alliances. Calder still thundered beyond the horizon with want. But she had chosen to hold Elias not as a secret tucked away, but as a person who belonged to the pack, because he had proven himself by tending its wounds. She reached for him and removed her gauntlet slowly, as if revealing a truth might burn her. She placed it in his palm, her chainmail glove dented at the knuckles from earlier fights. The gesture was dangerous, ceremonial, intimate. "It is not mine to hand," she said, voice small. "This is a token I should never have taken off when I first put it on, but I give it anyway." Her words were not an abdication. They were an offering. Elias stared at the gauntlet as if it were a relic. Then he put his hand over hers and the glove, surrounding it with kindness and with promise. "I do not ask to wear your mantle," he said. "I only ask to be seen beside you." Mara felt something in the crowd, a shift so subtle it might have been imagined. The full moon above seemed to lean closer, as if curious. In that small, private moment between them, she made a choice that was public and defiant and tender all at once. She moved to take his hand, and he did not flinch. The world could break them for this. Calder could still howl and bite. But the Luna had laid down armor in favor of holding a human stead, and in doing so, she had claimed a different kind of leadership, one that would protect, not by making stone of herself, but by learning how to keep soft things from breaking. They walked back to the village together, not as a Luna and a healer bound by complaint, but as two people who had chosen to stand in the same weather. Behind them, the pack watched and learned that a leader could hold a person and still keep a border. Calder lurked, angry and patient. But for now, the North Watch had weather, and in its wake, a small redemption had been sown, a claim that would be ugly and messy and luminous and perhaps worth everything. The village woke differently after the ridge, lighter in a way that surprised Mara. People moved with a cautious pride, as if the air itself had learned new vocabulary, survival that did not always demand sacrifice of softness. Elias worked through the mornings with the same careful rhythm, bandage, salve, whispered names of herbs, and the guards who once watched him with suspicion now paused, sometimes openly, to thank him when he set a broken bone or eased fevered skin. Calder sulked and plotted, as men with large appetites and small patience do. But his raids lost their moral authority. The pack had seen with their own eyes that tenderness and strategy could coexist when held by someone brave enough to try. The council begrudgingly accepted Mara's reforms, a rotating volunteer guard, hearings that valued testimony over rumor, and training that taught watchfulness without becoming cruelty. It was not a perfect settlement. Some nights the whispers returned, and Mara learned to meet them with work rather than words. She spent mornings at the border and evenings in the infirmary, hand in hand with the strange collision of her roles, Luna and protector, woman and leader. Elias remained beside her in ways that were not secret anymore. He walked the ridge with a sling at his side, stitching not only flesh, but also the frayed edges of a community that had nearly torn. When children saw them together, they paused, then resumed their play with the kind of acceptance that grows like moss over stone, quietly inevitable. Once, beneath a moon that had softened since the storm, Mara led a small council of elders to the riverbank where the pack and the village met. She spoke plainly about fear and about how it could be stoked into violence, and she asked the elders to help teach restraint as if it were a skill as essential as tracking or tending wounds. No one cheered. No one needed to. The act itself, an honest request offered without theater, was its own quiet triumph. At night, when the world narrowed to the sound of water and the small animal breaths of the huts, Mara and Elias sat by the healer's lamp and let conversation be ordinary. A shared recipe, a remembered joke, the small grievances of a town mending. Sometimes they touched hands without declaration, and those touches were enough, a promise made in the currency of daily life. Calder's shadow lengthened now and then. He remained a test rather than a verdict. But the pack had learned a new grammar. Leadership could hold tenderness without breaking. Love could be a stubborn strategy. In time, children grew up knowing a Luna who could wear chainmail and offer a bandage with equal surety. Mara taught them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep someone in sight even when it was dangerous. Elias taught them that healing was a kind of bravery that kept people whole. In the hush before dawn, Mara sometimes rose alone and walked to the ridge where the moon found the world in gray. She would take Elias's gauntlet, kept on a peg by the healer's door like a small relic, and touch it, thinking of every choice that had led there. The river moved on as it always had, patient and indifferent and steady. She smiled into the dim and felt, for the first time since she was taught to carve commands into the air, that authority could be an offering rather than a sentence. The future would not be without cracks, but under her hand and beside him, it would hold people who could be both fierce and gentle. The moon leaned in, and Mara let the light map the shape of them. Two figures on the ridge, neither perfect nor safe, but refusing to make of the other a thing to be given up.